Hello, everyone, and welcome to Front Seat to Climate Change. I'm your host, Mahin Azam Khan. Climate change is no longer something we speak only about in terms of rising temperatures or melting glaciers. It is increasingly shaping economies, livelihoods, public health, and the future of development itself. For countries like Pakistan, the impacts are becoming impossible to ignore. From extreme heat waves and water shortages to energy stress and growing economic vulnerability. In today's episode, we'll be discussing the economic cost of a hotter world, exploring how rising temperature are affecting productivity, labor, infrastructure, and economic growth across the global south, while also looking at the growing importance of climate adaptation and climate finance. Joining us today is Anam Rathor, Program Lead, Pakistan, Climate Vulnerable Forum and Vulnerable 20 Group, who will help us unpack these critical issues and what they mean for countries like Pakistan moving forward. Hello, Anam. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. Assalamu alaikum.
So Pakistan is already, experiencing increasingly intense heat waves and water stress. And climate change is often discussed in an environmental issue, but increasingly it's becoming an economic issue as well and a development challenge as well. So how vulnerable is Pakistan's economy to the impacts of extreme heat and climate change?
So Pakistan's economy is highly vulnerable to climate because the climate impacts it hits sectors that are central to job, to food, to security, exports, and public spending. So if you talk about agriculture, construction, transport industry, energy, water, health sector, they're all climate sensitive. So when there is a heat wave or when there is a climate shock, it's not only a weather event anymore. It affects the crop yields, it affects the labor productivity, electricity demand increases, public health is being impacted and household income is being impacted. So when there are flood, the damage is not just limited to homes and roads. It affects the supply chain, schools, hospitals, livelihoods, food prices, and even public debt. So if you look at the 2022 floods, it caused 30 billion USD damages. 33 million people were impacted, and there were over 1,000 deaths. So it roughly impacted around 2.2% of Pakistan's GDP. In May 2024, Mohenjo-daro recorded, around 53 degrees of heat. It was among the highest temperatures in Asia that day. And a couple of weeks later, in June same year, another heat wave swept Sindh, and ED Foundation reported that in just Karachi, in over 5 days, there were over 500 deaths related to heat. So the most important point is that climate change is not affecting the basic engines of Pakistan, is now affecting the basic engines of Pakistan's economy. So if these systems are under stress, economic growth also becomes really fragile. So for Pakistan, I'll say climate change is not a future environmental risk. It is already an economic risk, and it affects how people work, how food is produced, how our cities function, and how much energy we need, and how much the government has to spend on recovery instead of development of the country.
Absolutely. I think you summed it up brilliantly that for Pakistan, climate change is now becoming and has already become an economic risk and an economic challenge. You also touched upon the fact that, it sorts of also impacts how people work. So a large part of Pakistan's economy, still depends on outdoor labor and climate sensitive sectors. So in sectors like construction, agriculture, transport, and daily wage labor, how is rising heat already, affecting productivity and livelihoods?
So Pakistan's labor market, I think we all know this, has a very large informal base. So according to the Bureau of Statistics, around 72% of the employment is informal employment in Pakistan, which agriculture, which remains a major employer. So this means that workers, they do not have the protection of that formal workers do. They don't have sick leaves, they don't have heat safety rules, they don't have insurance, they don't even have a place, we're talking about a cool workplace, and they don't even have stable contracts. So this is why when we talk about heat waves, it becomes an inequality multiplier. it hurts everyone. Everyone in Pakistan is impacted, but informal workers first and hardest are the ones that are hit. So when we talk about rising heat, it usually impacts informal workers in firstly, it reduces their work hours. We talk about a construction worker or a farmer or a street vendor or even a rickshaw driver or a loader. They cannot work in extreme heat. If they slow down, they may earn less because they are again daily wages. So and if they continue working in the heat, they risk serious health impacts. Secondly, heat, it increases the cost. Worker, they need more water, they need medical care, transport, rest. So even cooling area. So for informal workers, they can't absorb these costs. And thirdly, heat increase also increases insecurity uh, for daily wagers because they are usually paid when they work. They do not have a paid leave again. They do not have health insurance. There's no social protection mechanisms. So a climate shock for them, it becomes a financial shock for their household. So uh, I would just say that for informal workers, heat is, not just a discomfort. For them, it means working fewer hours, lower wages, and more illness and more debt.
Agreed. For informal workers, heat is actually, a threat to their wages and to the amount of money that they earn. And this, also brings me to the wider issue and the basic issue of climate change, that those who contribute to the least are actually, impacted the most when it comes to climate change. And Pakistan also, relatively contributes little to global emissions, yet, it faces severe climate impacts. So why do you think that countries like Pakistan bear a disproportionate economic burden from climate change?
So, at the heart of the climate crisis, there is this injustice that we just talked about. Pakistan has contributed very little to global emissions that have caused climate change, but geographically, economically, even socially, we are exposed to these, climate impacts. So, uh, Pakistan has this disproportionate burden. Firstly, if you look at our geography, we have glaciers, rivers, we have arid zones, we have dense cities, but we have also floodplains and long agriculture economy, which is all exposed to climate stress right now. Our economic structure, which makes a large part of our employment, is now climate sensitive, and a lot of informal sectors as well, which are related to, again, agriculture and all these sectors which have become climate sensitive. And thirdly, there is limited fiscal space. So when a disaster happens, Pakistan has fewer resources for rapid recovery, for resilient reconstruction, and even long-term adaptation compared to richer countries. So the burden is disproportionate, not only because of exposure, but because of the capacity for Pakistan to respond to these climate impacts, which is also unequal. So climate injustice is not only about, who emitted the most. That is an important part of it, but I think for a country like Pakistan, it is also really important that who has the resources to protect themselves. We as Pakistanis are paying for a crisis, the climate crisis that we did not create, while we're also trying to finance development, jobs, energy access, and poverty reduction at the same time. So we can say like we're in a double crisis right now.
And absolutely adding on to what you said, that, at the same time, rising temperatures are creating an additional pressure on already, like you mentioned, strained infrastructure systems. Heat waves, they place enormous pressure on electricity demand, especially, in cities like Lahore and Karachi and other cities as well. But how do these energy shortages and rising cooling, then how do energy shortages and rising cooling need to create wider economic challenges for Pakistan?
So as heat waves happen, there is an increase in the cooling demand, especially if you talk about cities like Lahore, Karachi, Multan, Hyderabad, the countries in the south of Pakistan, which are very badly impacted. But if the energy system is already under stress, which it is in Pakistan, so this creates a chain reaction. Household, they need more electricity for fans, cooler, air conditioning. Even businesses, they face higher operating costs. Hospitals, they need reliable maybe generators and especially in play when a heat emergency happens. They also need more power. Uh, Again, being an agriculture country, the cold chain for a lot of agriculture products, for food, for medicine, that also becomes really important. And if there's an outage, the productivity falls. Small businesses suffer and even becomes a public health risk. So there is also an inequality issue that comes here. So, higher income households, they may use air conditioning or a solar backup, but lower income households, where again a lot of informal workers are living, which who have already, their livelihood is being impacted. These and the places that they live in is mostly in a dense housing area where there is poor ventilation, there is unreliable electricity. So the same heat wave has very different impacts across different income groups as well. So for a country like Pakistan, or for developing countries which are again disproportionately impacted by climate change, cooling has also become a development issue. uh, there is access to affordability, and reliable cooling is related to health, productivity, education, dignity. And yeah, so there is also the increased economic stress which it is causing, with the health stress as well.
Cooling is actually, like you mentioned, it has actually become a fundamental issue now. It's linked to so many other things. And, the summer season is actually longer now in Pakistan. It's just May, and the average temperatures are 42 degrees Celsius, which obviously will impact the informal sector and the informal worker in ways that will impact, his or her productivity. Absolutely. Um, and while we're talking about this, we must not forget that water security is also, increasingly being linked not only to environmental sustainability, but also to economic resilience. And it's also becoming an increasingly concern across Pakistan. So, how connected do you think are climate change, water insecurity, and long-term economic stability in this country?
So I'd say they're very deeply connected because, water insecurity, it affects almost every part of Pakistan's economy. Agriculture is impacted by water insecurity, that impacts the food prices, drinking water, we talk about, which then, both of them combined impacts health, then hydropower, industry sector, urban planning. Water insecurity affects all of it. So, and climate change, it is making water less predictable. Pakistan can face too much water in one season, and when floods happen, but then there's too little water in another through droughts and groundwater stress. So this unpredictability is dangerous for farmers, for cities, for investors. As I said, it impacts all parts of Pakistan's economy. Water insecurity also, creates social tension. With if there is a per capita decrease in water availability, then we're becoming a water scarce country. Farmers can lose crops, rural incomes are falling, and then if we look at cities, if there's a shortage there, then the household costs rise. And again, industries face unreliable water, so the production suffers. So water stress can become a driver for poverty, again, then migration and overall instability in the country.
Absolutely. And I think it is becoming a driver for all these things that you mentioned. So often, the indirect economic costs of climate change, they receive far less attention than the visible environmental impacts. And healthcare systems in Pakistan are, already also under strain. What are some of the hidden public health and economic costs that are associated with rising temperatures and extreme heat events?
If you look at the hidden costs of rising temperature, they're very significant. Heat, firstly, heat can increase dehydration. There is heat exhaustion. There are heat strokes. It can cause kidney stress, cardiovascular risks. Pregnant women are being impacted. It also called mental stress and mental health issues. So, plus combined with if the air quality is worsened, it can cause a lot of disease outbreaks are as well, after floods or there's water contamination. So I think it is it does impact a lot, but the economic cost at that time are a little less visible when we talk about heat. A sick worker, if they lose their wage, or if a family spends more on treatment, or children missing school, or women do a lot of unpaid care work, but their unpaid care work also increases. There are more patients in hospital, employers lose productivity. So these are they do impact the economic cost, but this is something that we do not think of it as a very big impact. But these small instances combined are very highly impactful. Public health costs. If you, as I said, these are not only these are very small costs combined, but they do impact the country a lot. So as again, hidden costs, but they're very significant.
I think they're absolutely very significant in today's Asian world also because when we talk about winter, smog rises and that makes so many people sick, especially the informal sector because they have to be outside. And of course, when we talk about summer, just like we are right now, heat stress is what is making, them sick. So these are some of the costs which the administration and the state has to consider in the future years. So many countries are also now recognizing that alongside reducing emissions, adapting to climate impacts is equally critical. And there's also growing discussion globally about climate adaptation rather than only mitigation. So, what does effective climate adaptation look like for a country like Pakistan?
I think if we just look at adaptation for now, specifically in Pakistan's lens, Pakistan has many policies and plans. I think the next step right now is implementation, and adaptation must become visible. We have to ensure that it's part of our budgets, it's part of city planning, the agriculture system, water infrastructure, housing, health systems, labor protection. Adaptation, we have a national adaptation plan, but we have to ensure that all other plans or anything that we're doing in this country, there should be an aspect of adaptation in it because the climate is changing and climate change is very cross-cutting. It impacts all the sectors. So we should look at every policy, every document from an adaptation lens.
Yeah.
But if we talk about effective adaptation for Pakistan, about the issues we're talking about right now, it means protecting people, infrastructure, livelihoods before the disaster happen. So if we talk about workers, especially we're talking about workers who are working out in the open, informal workers. But even for informal workers, there should be, the government should ensure that there are heat safety standards and there are like, shaded areas for rest, even if people are, out in the streets. There should be social protection for, citizens who maybe earn a specific amount of wage. If we look at our cities, so there should be, a lot of trees in urban areas. There should be shaded public areas. We should have heat action plans. We should have, roof systems of all the houses and buildings should be made into green roofs or cool roofs. Agriculture is important that we move to climate smart crop system, efficient agriculture. There should be advisory services, especially for small farmers, because when we talk about a heat wave is coming or anything like that, so farmers should have advisory services. There should be groundwater regulation, floodplain management. When we talk again about heat, there should be a heat early warning system and community health outreach programs. Solarization, if we talk about energy, the cooling system should be somehow made affordable so that everyone can afford it. And then when we talk about adaptation and we talk about how do we finance all of this, there should be a project pipeline for Pakistan, because we're talking about how you know urban trees or health safety standards or all these things, but the government need a project for that how they're going to do it, how they're going to implement this on ground, so that should be ready. uh, and then we should also look into how we can finance this. There should be maybe added into government's annual development plans, and then how can we involve private sector uh, through it as well. So it's like as I said, climate change is a very cross-cutting issue, and it's important that all sectors work together to ensure that adaptation is part of the planning.
Course, and I think adaptation at scale, requires financial resources, collaboration, institutional capacity, all of the things that you mentioned. And Pakistan often, highlights climate finance also in international climate negotiations. So, touching a bit upon that, why is climate finance so important for developing countries that are facing adaptation challenges?
I think, as we talked about what kind of work we want to do on ground to ensure that we're ready for climate change, any action, climate action, be it mitigation or adaptation, it requires finance. We cannot do anything on ground without finance, and especially right now, that's what we say that for Pakistan, a lot of our finance, all the money, and even more than what we have, goes into when a flood happens or when a heat wave happens, like more into action at that time. But we need long-term planning, and for that, we need climate finance, which is very expensive. And many adaptation measures, they do not generate immediate commercial returns. For example, we talk about heat shelters, drainage systems, resilient health systems, early warning systems, or even flood protection. They may save lives and reduce future losses, but they do not always produce a direct revenue stream. So that's why we need to ensure that, and that's why we talk about adaptation finance or even grant finance and concessional finance, because they're essential for a country like Pakistan to ensure that we're ready for whatever disaster we're going to face because of climate change. And for a lot of developing countries, the borrowing cost is very high. If Pakistan has to borrow at expensive rates to respond to climate disasters, it did little to cause. That creates a climate justice issue, because climate impacts, they increase debt, they increase debt, and then this debt, it reduces the ability to invest in resilience. And I think this is what Pakistan has always been saying, that climate finance is not charity. It is part of the climate justice, and it is, it's also smart economics, that in every invested rupee in resilience can stop us for a lot of larger loss tomorrow. But if you look at the global climate architecture, right, climate finance architecture right now, so what's happening globally? As I said, climate finance is essential, but the ODA, the Official Development Assistance, which is the money that usually goes to climate, stressed and developing countries, it goes to bodies like, that's where the UN and the World Bank and ADB, a lot of their money comes from ODA. And this ODA globally is shrinking. It is estimated that a quarter of ODA would shrink by, I think, by 2026. So yeah, so I think what do you call it, in really, if you look at, that our climate impacts at one hand are increasing and we need more money, but on the other hand, the official assistance or the finance we need for this climate action and climate adaptation is decreasing. So countries like Pakistan are, we can say, in a lot of trouble. So what we can do? Uh, I'll talk about what my organization where I work is working with the Ministry of Finance and Ministry of Climate Change, that how can we make these climate issues or this climate impact into economic gain. Is that we should ensure that we need to stop relying on a lot of aid, because as I said, it's decreasing. So how, and our country should invest in, should develop its own projects for climate change, where we take money from investors and we ensure that uh, the impacts of climate change, how can we make it into something that's also bankable? Like if we work on sustainable farming or climate smart farming, how in the long run it is going to give us less loss and we're going to make more money, and how that can be made into a bankable project. So as I said, uh, the argument is that climate vulnerable countries need a lot of finance that recognizes vulnerability. But uh, we can't rely on ODA anymore. We can't rely on Global North anymore because every other day, as I said, a news comes that they're reducing finance for countries like Pakistan, which again, we didn't do much to be in this climate mess that we are. So again, so we have to rely on ourselves. And I'll say it's really important that we have project pipeline on ground, which where we can, in get our own capital, raise our own capital, and work to ensure that those projects they make jobs, they're good for the workers, and they also work on climate adaptation and both mitigation.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for this brilliant answer. And I would just like to touch upon what you mentioned that, climate finance is not charity. That's such a powerful thing. And that's exactly, what the world and especially the global north, needs to understand. And with that being said, absolutely, like we need to, mobilize our own systems and we need to have our own projects and we need to do local capacity building. So now many developing countries, they, continue to argue that there is a significant disconnect, like you mentioned, between climate pledges and actual delivery. So do you think the international climate finance commitments are sufficient for countries like Pakistan? Or do you think there's still a significant gap between promises and reality?
No, yeah, there is a huge, I'll say like a major gap between what is promised and what happens in reality. Even like, in international climate finance architecture, they use the word pledge. So a lot of countries pledge money, and that's when we become happy, like, oh, they pledge this much to green finance or this much for adaptation. But those pledges do not materialize. So a lot of the times when we calculate climate finance or how much money there is globally, we calculate those pledges. But unfortunately, as I said, they don't materialize, and that's where the major gap is. Even when the pledges happen, there is a huge gap. Like, the pledges never reach the need on ground. And then when those don't materialize, the gap further increases. So as I said, firstly, the amount is not enough. Countries like Pakistan, our development needs are really high and the current flows are really low. And then the quality of finance or the kind of finance also matters. There's a lot of finance that comes as loans. Whereas when we talk about adaptation, that is really important for Pakistan, what we need is a lot of concessional finance or we need grants. And then there's the accessing this finance in a lot of cases is very difficult. They're like really complex application processes. There's a long timeline. There's transaction costs are so high. And we talk about these big funds, vertical funds. So this is becoming, when we talk about what is happening in the climate impacts that we're facing, it's very urgent. But yeah, as I said, the climate finance globally is declining. The processes are difficult, and we're not able to access it as quickly or as much as we want to. So as I said before, that this is why we need a strong investment pipeline for Pakistan and a national ownership, because we cannot wait for these scattered opportunities. We need to ensure that we have our own priorities ready when these global negotiations happen, and we have to ensure that where the right sources is, and as a country Pakistan, we can match them and tell them that please, this is what we need and this is where the finance is required.
Agreed, absolutely. And finally, despite these challenges and conversations around climate finance, resilience, and adaptation, they're becoming more prominent globally. So, looking ahead, if countries in the global south, including Pakistan, fail to adequately adapt to rising temperatures, how could climate driven heat affect future economic growth, development, and social stability?
So if countries like Pakistan, we do not adapt this climate-driven heat, it could slow our growth, and it can impact us through a lot of multiple pathways. It can reduce labor productivities. We're talking about outdoor and informal work especially, and it lowers agriculture output would be lowered, which will impact food prices. Energy demand is increasing, which will again, we're already going through, a power stress in the country, which will get worsen. Health costs will increase, which will impact a lot of, like, if you talk about learning impacts or children who go to school, that will also be impacted. There's a lot of climate-induced migration because the place a lot of people are living, if that becomes, you can't farm there, the heat is really high, so people will move to cities, which will also cause stress there because if a lot of people are moving to another place, is that other city or place capable of managing those people? So over time, this does cause a lot of social stability issues. And I'll just say that adaptation is, not a, side agenda for Pakistan anymore. It is central to our economic stability, job creation, public health, and a lot of social peace. So if we fail to adapt, if we cannot, adapt the whole country to climate change, this heat, it will not only affect the weather, but it will affect the economy, which is already is, but over time it will, get even worse. It will impact our labor market and the social contract of this country.
Absolutely. And I think you summed it up brilliantly already that adaptation is not a side agenda for Pakistan. It has to be central to everything that we're looking in terms of climate change. Thank you so much for your brilliant insights, Anam.
Thank you.
Today's conversation was an important reminder that climate change is not only an environmental issue, it is also an economic, developmental, and human challenge, particularly for vulnerable countries like Pakistan. From heat stress and water insecurity to adaptation gaps and climate finance, the impacts of a hotter world are already being felt around us. And as these countries continue to grow, conversations like these become increasingly important in helping us understand not only the risks we face, but also the solution and resilience needed moving forward. I'm Mahin Azam Khan, and this has been Front Seat to Climate Change. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode.